This episode, I'm joined by Wolfgang Palaver, who is a philosopher and Catholic theologian. He is the author of Rene Girard's Mimetic theory and Transforming the Sacred into Saintliness, reflecting on violence and religion with René Girard. In this episode, we discuss the mimetic theory of René Girard, alongside discussions on Christian spirituality, desire, Thomas Hobbes, violence, and more. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you would like to support Hermetics podcast or become part of the community, please find links in the description below. Enjoy. So, Wolfgang Palaver, thanks very much for joining us on Hermetics podcast. We are going to be discussing the work of René Girard, but we're also going to be discussing your two texts on him, one which has been recently published and one which was published in 2013. So the first one was René Girard's Mimetic theory, which focuses on, as you would imagine, René Girard's mimetic theory and mimesis, which sort of is found throughout. It's something I don't think Girard could ever get away with once he had that realization. And then your second text, which you sent to me, published just last year, Transforming the Sacred into Saintliness, reflecting on violence and religion with René Girard. Now, with Girard, like many other philosophers, all of his sort of key themes and ideas, most notably mimetics and mimesis, the sacred, the scapegoat, and then violence in relation to religion, these are almost always touching on one another. They're not, how can we say, completely separate. They can't really be taken completely on their own. They're always in combination with these other things. So I think in that sense, this conversation should sort of flow quite nicely into certain avenues of Girard's thought. But before we sort of jump in, just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be working with Girard and, what is it you do?
Yeah, let me first say thanks for inviting me. I'm happy and glad to help to get to a better understanding of Girard's mimetic theory. So my engagement in some way goes back to two interests in my early years as still in school. That was, first of all, I was very much interested in ethnology, in anthropology, so I was reading books in that regard. When my family uttered the wish to become an expert in that field. I'm an Austrian, and Austria is not a colonial power, never was. Even when it was an empire, it was not a colonial power. So there are no anthropologists, or not a lot, in the tradition compared to France or the United Kingdom. So that idea was completely dismissed. And then I followed in the footsteps of my father and got educated as a technician in electronics and communicational engineering. And in the last years of this special high school, I became a member of the Catholic Youth Movement, and that was in the late 70s, early 80s of the last century. And we were heavily engaged in the peace movement against the establishment of Pershing II rockets and missiles. And so I became a member of the peace movement. And this engagement in peace movement turned me to studying theology. And so in 1979, I started to study Catholic theology at the University of Innsbruck. And quite soon I came across a Swiss Jesuit with the name Raimund Schwager, who was teaching dogmatics at the Catholic Theological Faculty at the University of Innsbruck. And Raimund Schwager was one of the first theologians who engaged deeply with Girard. So the two of them met, I think, in 1974, and they had a lot of exchanges, meetings. Just recently, the letter exchange between the two of them was published. And both of them published in 1978, so just a year before I started studying, books that engaged for the first time with the Bible from the perspective of mimetic theory. So Raimund Schwager's book's title, I refer to the English translations, was Must There Be Scapegoats? and Girard's book, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. Both came out in 1978, and both were for the first time reading the Bible with the help of earlier anthropological insights by René Girard. So this was 1979, and I met Girard in the context of Raimund Schwager in 1986 in Germany at the conference for the first time. And at that time, I started to work on my dissertation, which was a Girardian reading of the relationship between religion and politics in the work of these political philosophers, Thomas Hobbes. And after I finished that, I was eager to go to Stanford University for a whole year to study closer with Girard. I was there at the Center of International Security and Arms Control, which was not a Girardian center, but gave me as someone who wanted to become an ethicist, working also in peace ethics and political philosophy, a place there. But it was also a good opportunity to meet about every second week in a little study group with Girard, and I also went to lectures of him on Shakespeare and to a special seminar on Aeschylus' Greek tragedies. And so I spent a year there. When I went back to Innsbruck, I gave for over 10 years introductory course to students in mimetic theory. And the outcome of these 10 years of teaching was my book on René Girard's mimetic theory. And I remained a close collaborator of Girard, and I met him afterwards quite often and was in contact until his death in 2015. So it became a Girardian, and I still claim to try to unfold the deeper meanings and insights of this anthropological theory.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I guess it's a piece of sort of philosophical history in a way, even though his as you said, he passed away quite recently, just 6 years ago. What was as someone who was close to him, what was Girard, like as a teacher and as a person?
I mean, as a teacher, he was really a teacher who got the students excited. So I went to his classes on Shakespeare. This was a course for undergraduates, but there were about 70, 80, maybe 100 people in a large lecture hall. But he didn't have a manuscript or so. So as you would expect from a German style of lecturing, he always there were certain plays of Shakespeare dedicated to each course lesson, and he always had just this particular play or the plays for this particular lecture with him, and freely talked about those, tried to engage the students. So it was a lot of fun, and he was a great teacher. The students liked him, and was just exciting to listen to him. And as a person, he was a quite shy person. He was also a modest person. So he, for instance, never talked about Girardian theory or Girardianism. So the term mimetic theory was coined by him, also differ a little bit from for too strong focus on himself as a person, and to see it as a larger project going beyond his own personal work.
Okay, he almost seems to be one of the last bastions of that style of teaching. Without a manuscript, the ability to just have this. I'm thinking of sort of Serre and Deleuze and the like of these people who just had a almost encyclopedic knowledge, could just draw from it and just walk into a room and go straight ahead. That's quite rare.
I mean, he just had at that time published a big book on Shakespeare, so he was deeply in this work, and he could just use this treasure and all these insights to make us curious, the students curious about what Shakespeare has to tell us today.
Okay, so moving just in before we get into strictly Girardian theory, I have to ask you the Hermetics question, which I think will be quite interesting now because so you can place three thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Who do you pick? But as we're talking about Girard and Girard's theory, we can include Girard. But also this question is interesting because perhaps in your relationship with Girard, perhaps there was some people that he would have liked to have put into a room and, perhaps that would, I'm wondering if that's where you take the question, is to see if there was ever anyone Girard wanted to sort of, almost.
I suppose I never talked to him about that, but I would suppose he would be very interested to have a conversation with those novelists that were part of his first book. His first book came out of a real eager and deep reading of Cervantes, Stendhal, Flaubert, Proust, and Dostoevsky. So probably to sit together with those five and talk about his book and his insight, because he was not so much interested in the difference between these quite different authors concerning language, culture, religious or worldview background, quite different thinkers, but he saw that they all shared a deep insight into mimetic desire. So I think he would have liked to talk to them. And my starting point to become a Girardian scholar was also, I read all the novels over a couple of years that were treated in the first book of Girard. So that gave me a good background to understand this book a little bit better. But I chose different names.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask, who would you play?
Yeah, it was difficult to stay with three, of course, because I'm a very curious person myself, and so there are a lot of people I would like to talk a little bit longer. But if you asked me for three, I came up with Thomas Hobbes, because that was the political philosopher with whom I was dealing over 5 years working on my dissertation. So it would be quite interesting to get to talk at least for an hour or two to this guy. And then there was a philosopher woman who was influential on Girard, although he did not talk that much about her, but I was reading in last 10 years a lot of her work. That's the French philosopher and mystic Simone Weil. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And currently I'm working on Mahatma Gandhi, who developed this concept of nonviolence. That's the reason why I'm currently in South Africa. And dealing with Mahatma Gandhi is the trial to look a little bit more at the positive side of ways out of violent entanglements. So I think that would be a nice group. And Simone Weil would have had a vague knowledge of what's going on in India at that time and heard about Mahatma Gandhi. Thomas Hobbes, of course, would have to be introduced to the other two, mm-hmm. But Gandhi and Weil would vaguely know about Hobbes. And I would like to be the chair and the host of this meeting and introduce them to each other and tell them why it's for me interesting to have them together.
That's interesting. I'm not too sure about Weil, and my reading of Hobbes is sort of you could almost call it the common one. But I think in terms of two figures throughout history, Gandhi and Hobbes are almost extreme ends of how they would, the teleology of where they want to get to. Hobbes with the war against all, and Gandhi with, as you say, a non-violent approach. Where do you think think they might find some middle ground?
All three of them, including Simone Weil, are very much interested in how we can have peace between human beings, because Hobbes, of course, starts with the war of all against all as his projection of a certain kind of natural stage. But of course, his Leviathan, his political philosophy, is an attempt how can peace be created, how can peace be available, achieved. So in that sense, there is a common denominator between Hobbes, Weil, and Gandhi. Of course, the the ways, the means are quite different. Although you would find here and there also some similarities. So it would be a nice meeting between the four of us.
Okay. Well, Hobbes comes in later on in relation to the scapegoat, but that's quite later on in terms of how the social contract comes about, and perhaps Vail and Gandhi will come in. But jumping, and I think these figures definitely will come in. This idea of attaining peace is something to do with not being caught up in a certain pressure to do something on a social or collective level, and also not offloading one's personal collective responsibility onto a scapegoat to justify some form of idolatry or violence in that sense. So these are all sort of related to Girard. But I think to begin, this was the big question for me, is because mimesis, or the theory of mimetics, Girard's theory of mimetics, is commonly understood as this idea that we simply mimic one another. We see a load of people doing something and we do it for the mere fact that everyone is doing it. And in that sense, it's sort of this positive feedback where we simply do something because others are doing it. Now, this seems to be almost the mimetic theory of mimetic. It's the one that's caught on, and it seems almost too simple to be true. So, my first question is simply to ask you, as someone who's studied with Girard and has written a book on this topic, is that the truth behind the theory, or is there more a deeper layer of complexity to it?
Yeah, of course, there is a deeper complexity to it. I mean, it's true. The first reaction of many people, if you introduce the main features, the main pillars of mimetic theories, that's banal. And what is the interesting thing about it? Because that's obvious and that's not so difficult to understand and to discuss, and so we can move on. But if you think about the entanglements, the consequences of mimetic desire, of imitative desire, you will soon get to deeper ground, to very important anthropological questions, to interesting religious, political consequences. So what seems at first sight as quite a simple idea unfolds itself as a very deep insight into the complexity of social relations, so to say.
Mm-hmm. So do you think, you mentioned the religious side of it and the religious connotations, and it seemed to me in reading your book and in doing this research that much of Girard is inherently religious. That's almost always there, even if he's mentioning it or not. And do you think that simplified version that I mentioned is almost a secular version of mimetics, which isn't really correct, because Girard's worldview is always taking into account religious means of understanding the world?
Mm-hmm. This is a quite tricky and complex question, because if we take Girard's first book, the English title is Deceit, Desire and the Novel. If you take this book, I would claim today, especially also with a hidden influence by Simone Weil, that this is a masterpiece of Christian spirituality. I even published an article where I make that strong claim. I mean, in the last chapter of this book shows that all these great European novelists underwent some form of conversion to understand their own entanglements in mimetic, imitative rivalries, and overcoming their own pride and their own entanglements. And this conversion can be seen as a religious conversion, as in the case of Dostoevsky, but it's very similar and analogous in a atheistic novelist like Proust. So there is a deeper religious ground in this first book, but you don't see it. So if you read it for the first time probably, and without looking at its religious underground, you will probably, and this is not something bad, you will probably just discover these important anthropological insights. And one of the interesting things, one of the first thinkers who really got excited about this book was the Marxist and atheist sociologist of religion, Lucien Goldman. And Lucien Goldman was the first who got a chair in Brussels of sociology of literature. And there is a famous inaugural address by Lucien Goldman, where he says, my new institution in Brussels, was in the early 60s, is built on three thinkers, on the work of three thinkers. Karl Marx, of course, because he was a Marxist sociologist. The second was the famous Marxist literary theorist George Lukács, a Hungarian. And the third thinker he mentioned was René Girard, who just published a first book and was a little bit beyond his 40s. And so how can it be that an atheist and Marxist sociologist finds this seminal book that at the same time can be seen as a masterpiece of Christian spirituality? So it's not so much that we have to go in a much obvious religious dimension to understand that, but to see maybe the deeper anthropology that Girard was always interested in. And we should not forget, although there are today Girardians who make a strong claim how deeply he was a theologian, he himself always said, I'm an anthropologist. And I can, of course, he was very much engaged in understanding the Bible, and his later work has a lot of important religious insights. But he always said, I'm not a theologian, so I'm not an expert on grace, on the mysteries, but I think I would like to uncover the anthropology that is so important for doing a good theology. So he very often quoted Simon Weil's insight that the Gospels are first of all an anthropology and not a theology. So therefore, we should not divide those two things in too strongly and make too much about it. I would say a proper understanding may show that there is not that big divide between secular and religious.
I see. So both of those can really assimilate
they can
together.
Converge, yeah.
For Girard under what we could call a Girardian anthropology, that really the same sort of functions and the same modes of understanding are actually prevalent in both in this anthropology.
I mean, he said once he sees himself as an apologist of a Christian anthropology. And I would say a good anthropology cannot exclude the religious dimension in a very broad sense understood of human life. And a good theology is highly recommended for a good theology to have a good grounding in anthropology, not to jump too quickly into heaven or into the realm of just ideas or whatever.
Okay. So before I sort of tackle this next question, which is related to the religious aspect of, how we can overcome mimetic theory, would you sort of say that my definition earlier on of mimetic theory was correct, or did I miss a few key features out?
It's important. There's one thing that is very important to understand, Girard's understanding of mimesis or imitation, because imitation was a key topic of Western philosophy from Aristotle and Plato onwards. So that's not an astonishing thing, and you find it in literature, you find it in a famous work of Erich Auerbach. So mimesis, imitation, was discussed for a very long time. What is new about Girard is that he, for the first time, understood a close connection between desire and imitation. So his insight that he got from those novelists was that as soon as our basic needs are fulfilled, we still have desires, and most of the time we do not really know what we should wish for. So we look at our peers, we look at people we admire, we look at our neighbors, and then we want to have the same thing as those neighbors or peers. And I came across already a couple of years ago insights in the work of Plato, but also in Augustine, who clearly understood as a key feature of human life that we human beings imitate what we adore. We imitate what we adore. And I think we can observe that in our own lives. We can observe that throughout history. So it's very difficult not to imitate what we deeply adore. And this is also maybe a core of an anthropological core of religious theory, to imitate what we adore.
So going from the Girardian desire, then, did he see that as having detrimental effects socially? Or did it,
Of course. First of all, I mean, that's very important. And I repeat that again and again because it's often misunderstood. Very often, people read Girard as a negative ontology, as a thinker only interested in conflict, violence, apocalyptic destruction, and so on. And this is not completely wrong, but it's a second stage. The first stage is that mimetic desire, mirroring other people, is a fundamental feature of human life. We could not become human beings without mirroring the thinking, the language, the being of others. So growing up, becoming a human being means mirroring other people. And for that reason, Girard is completely right to claim in one of his books that mimetic desire is intrinsically good. And this sentence, I repeat that sentence again and again, because only if you really accept these premises that mimetic desire is intrinsically good, then you can look at what Girard has to say about the temptations, about the negative consequences that easily come along, not automatically, but easily. We can be caught up in mimetic rivalries, in violence, in mimetic entanglements, in envy, in jealousy, in revenge, in counter-violence, and so on, out of this mimetic mechanism. But it's not necessary, it's just highly likely.
Okay, so there is almost a split between that inherent mimetics where we have to survive and take part in society, and we have to exist in some way, and we have to be a member of this collective to, as you say, get on and mature. But at the same time, it seems when you mention sort of rivalry, envy, jealousy, hatred, it seems that there's an emotional aspect coming in. And is that for Girard artificially created from some sort of perhaps an institution or a social framework which wants to almost use this mimetic for its own end? Is that artificially created, or is that developed somewhere else, this sort of emotional aspect where we begin to be angry or envious, etc.?
I mean, I would say both in some way. Of course, there are cultures and frameworks and conditions that make envious behaviors more likely. Mm-hmm. But there is also this just nearly natural entanglement of human beings. I mean, I think a little feeling of envy or jealousy, I at least feel every day, a slight attempts you feel all the day, because as relational beings, we always are in connection with others and always easily seen as, do we have really the same as the others? Do we get the same chances or not? So it's very difficult to imitate desire of the others and not get caught up in envy, jealousy, and rivalry. And so if you look at the great masters of human wisdom, the great religious traditions, most of them deal with this temptation. And the great masters tell us also, even if you are 90, you still have to work on those challenges for your character. So growing up and mature means to get to know how to deal with those things. I mean, that's, for instance, also a Girardian reading of the life and his life experiments of Mahatma Gandhi, who understood those temptations quite well and also tried in his own life to find out ways to overcome it. So the more you are possessive, the more you are going for material goods or worldly positions. If you focus too much on those things, it's necessarily that you get caught up in entanglements and problematic rivalries with others.
So this then was why for Girard he saw Christianity as that means to overcome it. Was there a reason he specifically saw Christianity as, you know, the means for overcoming that emotional form of mimetic desire, as opposed to, as you say, other religious masters? Perhaps Hermeticism touches on this, certain forms of other perennialism touches on this emotional thing.
I mean, he grew up in at least half Christian family. So his mother was quite devout Catholic. His father was anti-clerical, secular. So he had both these sides in his own family. So for when he so until the later 30s, after his young life, he lost belief in Christianity and religion, and it was his work on his first book. The final chapter, so to say, is also a biographical conversion in himself, when he himself turned back to religion, more to the side of his own mother. So I would say to go deeper into his own religious upbringing and his own tradition is just a natural step. I mean, if you find in your own tradition those possibilities to overcome rivalries, envy, and jealousy, I think that's just the most natural way to do. And as I see him in that direction. Also, the authors, of course, that he read, those novelists, were part of the Western tradition. And for instance, in the case of Cervantes or also Dostoevsky, clearly inspired by Christianity, and also Proust, who was an agnostic. You see clearly the Christian background. So he just got to a deeper understanding of a Christianity that was, of course, part of the Western tradition. Mm-hmm. And maybe in his later systematizations of his insights, he sometimes overdid it a little bit, in the sense that he claimed, not always, and there are also doors to open in a broader direction, but when he claims a superiority of Christianity, so to say, or when he said sometimes only Christianity solves those problems, I think he's overdoing a little bit the way he found in his own life, and which is a good way. And I myself am a Catholic theologian, and I would not say that you cannot find in the Christian tradition these advices and these role models to go to a good way. But I would say, and this is also building up on Girard, if Girard's anthropological insight is really an insight into the anthropology of human beings, it would just be natural to find similar insights in all the great traditions of the world. And if you talk to specialists about Buddhism, or you engage with Gandhi, or with Muslim thinkers, Jewish thinkers, you will find a lot of similar ways, not the same, but addressing similar problems and looking for solutions in a parallel way, so to say.
I guess that's a really interesting point, though, because you sort of to play quite ironically, to play devil's advocate here. You know, when we look at religions, almost going from I'm not a Marxist, but going from that Marxist famous quote of religion is the opium of the masses. You know, that itself would be religion with its rituals and its tradition. Each religion is its own sort of closed mimetic loop where people get caught up in it. How, for Girard, can we sort of get beneath these, or use something from within a collective mimetic sort of feedback, and use that to actually overcome the mimesis itself, if you see what I mean? So when you're within Christianity, or whether you're within a religion, you are doing something collectively, you are imitating certain things. How can, for Girard, we use something in that to overcome it, to overcome the actual mimesis itself?
The most important thing is, or what Girard would immediately respond, there is no way out of mimesis. because that would mean, but now we have to look a little bit deeper into the broader meaning and understanding of mimesis, because to get out of mimesis would be to get out of relations, to get out of affinities with other people, with models and so on. So he would say the most important thing is what kind of models do you choose for your own way of life. And so as a Christian, he referred, especially in later writings, again and again to Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ's way of life is not acquisitive, it's not a greedy way of life. It's not focused on material things or worldly success. So if you follow his life in your own life, it's less likely to get caught up in mimetic rivalry and jealousy, envy, or fights over material possessions or worldly positions.
So it's almost like using mimesis against itself in a way.
Yeah. Because to think we can go beyond mimesis in general would mean you do it all out of your own strength, and this is probably completely impossible. Here one could refer to Simon Weil, who said, you cannot be an egoist. It's impossible to be an egoist because we do not really believe in our inner strength, because we feel a certain lack in ourselves. And I mean, the most exciting and most difficult question is always the question, what is the deeper reason? What is the origin of our imitative behaviors? And Girard did not explore it very deeply, but he took up a concept of an atheist philosopher, of Jean-Paul Sartre. So Jean-Paul Sartre talked about humanity's lack of being. So human beings have a lack of being, feel a lack of being. And Girard took that concept of Sartre without taking the whole of Sartre's philosophical background. So if you read Girard's understanding of this lack of being, you are reminded of Kierkegaard's insight that we are creatures, and meaning that we are creatures means we are not autonomous, self-created beings who are completely in control of ourselves, but we are dependent. We are not in this world already fulfilled. So we are longing for a fulfillment that is probably impossible as long as we live in this world. And the second thing I would like to mention is, because I listened to one of your podcasts before, to the session on Ernest Becker. And it's very interesting to study Girard and Becker, because I think Becker's insight into what human mortality means is a very good explanation what the lack of being means. Mm-hmm. And I can observe it in my own life. I read it in all the great literature and I see it all over the place. We all feel a certain lack. We all feel incompleteness. But we look at other people and often we assume other people don't have this incompleteness. Others don't feel that lack that we feel. And so we imitate others or take others as models because we feel they are already complete, so to say. And it takes a little bit longer, or it takes growing up to a mature person to realize that we all have this lack of being. So we should not worry too much about this lack of being, should see it as just a consequence of being a creature. And then look at the religious and philosophical traditions of deeper wisdom, because they all respond to that question. So therefore, Girard's answer to the question is to take the proper model. And when I talk about a model, we should always also avoid a misunderstanding of imitation in the sense of a narrow, blind copying. So following mimetically or imitating a model does not mean we have to copy the hairstyle or the outlook. I mean, if I think about those things, I'm immediately always reminded of the famous Monty Python movie, The Life of Brian, when the people think you have to wear certain sandals and you have to wear certain clothes and do the right things. I mean, this is a caricature and funny. In English, it's a little bit difficult to explain. In German, it's easier, and Immanuel Kant has drawn on those words. In German, we have for imitation the word Nachahmung. Mm-hmm. And this can easily be understood as a blind, narrow copying, to be a copycat. But this is not the way out of mimetic rivalries. The other term in German is Nachfolge. That means to follow another person, but not in the sense we copy the other person, but we follow the other person to the source that he in such way draws on. And the English term, which now has no longer this word nach, this imitative, is discipleship. So in the Christian tradition, Nachfolge means discipleship, and discipleship doesn't mean we copy the hairstyle of Jesus. We even don't know who he looked like, but to live a life according to his spirit, which might be different in the 21st century than it was at Jesus' time in many ways. But it can be in a deeper sense, nevertheless, be a following or discipleship.
So do you think for Girard that differentiate the split there that you've created between the disciple and the imitative is where, and imitation is where we'd find that emotional sort of violent, envious on the imitation side, and on the discipleship is a more an understanding, a peaceful, a potentially peaceful, and it's between those two modes, which do seem very alike, where we'd find this key difference in two types of mimesis.
I mean, the difference is not so much connected to the words, because you can also talk about a positive mimesis, a positive imitation. It is really about the model. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing, Girard sometimes mentioned, and I like that distinction very much, between a guru, because many, let's say, bad gurus say in some way, try to be an original person, try not to be an imitator by imitating me, because I'm really an original person. So this is kind of, you are immediately caught up in the trap, because you imitate someone who pretends to be imitating no one, but he needs, of course, his imitators, his followers, who have his own strong self-conviction. If you take as an example Jesus and many other great spiritual masters, Jesus never said, follow me because I am the original person. He said, follow me because I follow the Father. Mm-hmm. So he was someone who was not focusing egoistically on himself, who was not desiring greedily, but was himself a model that showed to the source of life, so to say, to God Father, when we say it in more secular terms. So to follow in this direction, I think, is a way leading out of mimetic rivalries and destructive imitative behavior, because you are not focusing on an object that cannot be divided. I mean, this was also a question for a very long time in the Christian tradition, but also in many other traditions. We need imitation, but how should we imitate without getting into envy and rivalry? So I was, for a couple of years ago, very interested. If you think about the early monasteries by the Benedictines, most of the earliest Christian in the Western tradition monks and monasteries, and they of course had the question immediately in such a close community, should there be imitation, should there be emulation in such a community or not? If you have no emulation, then the people became lazy, indifferent. Such a community would quickly die out. If you have, however, hot, envious relationships, this community will also destroy itself quickly. So it's very important on what is the object, what is the deeper goal of your emulation. So the tradition, this was interestingly until the 17th century, until Thomas Hobbes, always distinguished between good emulation and destructive envy. Mm-hmm. And structurally, they are very close because you are influenced by the other. But the real difference is what is the object of your emulation. So if you emulate doing good to others, if you emulate a good spiritual life, if you emulate the desire for God, you are not automatically prone to violence. But if you emulate the other to become rich or the most famous or the best professor or the best student of mimetic theory, then you are easily in troubles.
So, that's interesting. You mentioned a while back that there's certain truths here in all religions in a certain sense in relation to this, in this following a discipleship or a spirit instead of the sort of the material, negative mimesis. Do you think then in Girard that there's a possible compatibility with a perennial truth, not in sort of a definable, this is the exact place we're heading to, we all have to do this, but a perennial truth in method, in the way that we should approach the world, in a sense?
Mm-hmm. I'm not too much familiar with perennialism and perennial philosophy. And so far as I know, Girard was always careful. So he didn't talk about that. And one or two occasions he was more careful not to be mixed up with this tradition. I myself think there is a deeper connection to that. And if we think that there is a spiritual anthropological core, what it means to be a human being, then I think that could be the basis of what I myself now try to do and to explore a little bit more closely to see how this core develops in the different religious traditions in our world. But we need to work a little bit more there has to be done more work to explore that question. That's an interesting question. Not to see the religious and wisdom traditions as totally different, but look at the deeper core where they are united. That's again very close what Gandhi understood, because he always said, beyond all the different religions and confessions, there is a deeper religion that unifies all those different religions. He talked about the different religions as branches on one tree. And this tree is, I think, close to what perennialism was looking for and what I'm now very interested in.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that's different from, ecumenicism, that in that sense? Because I think there would be disagreements from sort of more orthodox branches. They would stake their claim in a way and not, aren't so open to that, compatibility amongst all religions.
Mm-hmm. I don't think I'm not able to answer that question, because I would need to read those arguments and those theses more closely and see is there a difference. I'm just saying that I think there is a deeper unity between traditions, and and of course, that doesn't mean relativism. It's a tricky field because there are a lot of misunderstandings possible if you focus strongly on the unity. But I'm interested in the unity without getting caught up in the misunderstandings. But we need to do more work to unfold it in a very clear and not misunderstood way.
Okay. Staying on the the current of religion. I mean, one of the really interesting things that you made clear in your book is that violence is that for Girard, violence is prior to religion, which I think is almost counterintuitive to what most people would see in terms of mimesis, that you'd have the mimesis first, everyone collects under or sort of utilizes a scapegoat to justify their violence, and then the violence is undertaken, so the violence is secondary. But actually, Girard always makes it clear that violence for him is this sort of a foundational aspect of reality for Girard.
I like very much the original title of his second book. That was the seminal book in regard to violence and religion. The French title was La violence et le sacré, and the proper English translation is Violence and the Sacred. So violence comes first, and the second term is not so much religion, but the sacred. And this is a special meaning how early religions dealt with human violence. And it's funny because the last 20 years I was working in very different circumstances again and again on violence and religion, and I was invited to lectures and seminars, and the invitation was always, would you like to give us a lecture on religion and violence? And I sometimes then said, no, I do not do lectures on religion and violence, but if it doesn't matter for you, I can do something on violence and religion. And most of the time I was accepted. But it's really interesting. I mean, my book, Transforming the Sacred into Saintliness, came out in a series of Cambridge University Press with the title Elements in Religion and Violence. And I worked at the Princeton Center for Theological Inquiry in a research seminar for half a year on religion and violence. So I always have to work on religion and violence. So that's the framework. But I insist we have to understand human violence first, and then relate it to religion. And it's not so much my concern to whitewash religion and to say religion has nothing to do with violence, but if we really would think that religion is the main cause of violence, first of all, it's very difficult to get to a definition of religion. And secondly, would you think, or can one really think, that if all religion would be abolished and all religion would disappear, there would no longer be any violence between human beings? I mean, this is a joke. This is hardly possible. So therefore, we have to understand the deeper roots of human violence, and mimetic rivalry is a key source, or as the late former chief rabbi of Great Britain, Jonathan Sacks, in his seminal book, Not in God's Name, claimed, and he refers to Girard, sibling rivalry. We should not overlook how sibling rivalry is a very powerful source of human violence, although this is not a nice insight, but one that we should not overlook too quickly. So we have to understand deeper reasons and causes of human violence, and then we can look in what way and historically, in what way was religion a helpful tool to overcome those problems? In what way was religion part of this problem? In what way religion can incite those problems and even make it more dangerous and leading to an apocalyptic version of destruction? So I think that would be a proper way. The other way is just to blame religion for problems that we all cause in our relationships.
Which would sort of actually be an articulation of the scapegoat theory, just using religion as the scapegoat for saying that's where violence is, we need to.
Yeah, right.
But then in doing that, they're sort of begetting the same violence, because if you're saying we need to get rid of religion because that will get rid of violence, then you have to be violent unto religion to do that. So you are still stuck in that same mimesis in a way.
Right. And scapegoating is always also a deferral of my own involvement. So in my book, I refer to a famous question by the Swiss writer Max Frisch, who sometimes in his diaries made a list of interesting questions one should ask himself and others. And one of his most intriguing questions was, have you ever killed a human being? And if you have not done that, can you explain why? So this is a question. I refer in my book to a study and survey that has been done in American universities, where at least among male students, I think it's up to 80-90%, that at least in the last year they had once at least a fantasy to get rid of an ugly and not nice person. It's a little bit lower among female students. But we all have our temptations towards violence. And I mean, it's interesting to discuss with people this question. I mean, why have we not killed someone? Maybe because we are cowards. We don't want to get caught up in a prison, and that's not so nice. And so on.
What's your answer, if you don't mind me asking? Why haven't you killed someone?
I mean, probably the first thing is just what I said. I would not be very happy to spend 20 years in prison. I mean, this is not a life I'm looking forward to. I mean, I hope I also developed some insights and some strength in myself to overcome first impulses to kill others. I mean, easily when I drive on the street and in traffic, I'm most prone to kill others that make me angry and so on. But of course, I know such impulses. I know my own violence and I think it's important to look also into your own negative possibilities and temptations. That's the first thing if you want to study violence, to take this more uncomfortable, unpleasant look.
Okay. And this, just to lead us back round to that, the first room with Hobbes, this scapegoat mechanism for you develops the social contract, that sort of anchor which the entire socius is almost bordering themselves against. Is that how it develops the social contract, or is there something else going on there?
I mean, the interesting thing is that the social contract theory, in some way, Hobbes is the first of, although he's a very interesting first thinker in that tradition, because this tradition in some way claims that human beings were rationally able to sit together and solve the problem of violence by establishing a state, by establishing a contract that is the foundation of the basic rules for living together. But I mean, if you just take Hobbes, and Hobbes claims that there was a war of all against all, so a deep crisis, a group in frenzy. And how can a group in frenzy sit calmly together and create a nice plan how they will live together more peacefully? This is not possible. This is just a construction, a later rationalization. So I think Girard's claim that an unconscious mechanism was the first possibility to overcome a crisis of rivalries in a tribal group by not knowing what they were doing, by creating the sacred, a religion out of men, a religion that in some way is able to project its violence inside the group to a scapegoat that is later divinized. I mean, one of the most difficult questions, although it's not so difficult if one explains it carefully, is that Girard claims for the early religions, really the early religions, today we would call it the pre-exile religions, that there is a double transference going on. So first of all, the group thinks that there is an evil person in our group who causes all the trouble. That's a scapegoat, and that's what we know also in our own life, in every family, in every classroom, in every faculty. You have scapegoats, And we always think if we can get rid of this scapegoat, all the problems will be solved, until we find out that we need another scapegoat afterwards because the troubles remain. But for those early cultures, they turn the scapegoat who is expelled or killed into the divinity of the tribe, because they also think that the beast that after his expulsion was finally present in the group is also provided by the scapegoat. So the scapegoat is the cause of all the troubles and the provider of peace. And this double transference, which turns these early divinities in ambiguous divinity who is violent and peaceful at the same time, and we go back to historical studies, religious studies, we see that early divinities had this double face. So this positive transference, that is something that we do not understand any longer in our modern world. We do not understand how a person that we see as just a troublemaker can also be seen as the giver of peace and harmony and so on. So this is the creation of the sacred. That is a first solution to human violence. It creates of course, a cultural violence, but that keeps the outbreak of a much more chaotic and destructive violence at bay. It contains violence in the double sense of the word contain. And so this is the better explanation of the same kind of understanding that was also tried to be explained with the help of the social contract theory. But now let's come back to Hobbes, because Hobbes is too sharp a thinker and philosopher not to also refer at least indirectly to the scapegoat mechanism, because he was thinking about, the thesis of Hobbes was, as long as there is no sword, as long as there is no sovereign, no power that can punish people who break the contract, who break the rules, as long as this sovereign is not established, the words will count for nothing. And but how can then the first contract be created? They cannot come out of words. And he said, well, and he, of course, also studied history and history of religion and traditions. He makes a very interesting observation that he said, well, an oath, a sacred oath, could be the first possibility. So if a group gets together and said, we swear an oath, meaning if one breaks the rules, God will punish this person. So that's a kind of warranty that words are kept, although the political sovereign is not yet established. And where he refers to this insight that sacred oaths may be a first human tool to make a society possible, he refers to history in the Roman history, a contract between the Romans and Alba Longa, the Albanians, in the early Roman history. And when they did this contract, when they did this treaty, they killed a pig. And they said, I kill now, so this was a ritual, a bloody ritual, I kill this pig. And whoever breaks the rules afterwards should be killed by God or by the group or whatever, as we kill now the pig. I mean, this is a more convincing type of bringing order in society. And of course, sacred oaths and this ritual, of course, have been the case throughout human history. And the scapegoat mechanism would be even a layer lower that explains the development and the offspring of those bloody rituals. So therefore, in Hobbes, you have the first theorist of social contract. But if you read his Leviathan carefully, you see also that he has a vague knowledge that on a deeper layer, there is the scapegoat mechanism as the first establishment of order in human groups that were in rivalrous chaos.
So there has to be an almost a mimetic acceptance of even just a possibility of something transcendent, which is above everyone. Otherwise, as you say, there is no superiority which actually would count for anything.
Yeah. I mean, that would, of course, be a social type of transcendence, as it was described by Emil Durkheim. We should not immediately mix it up with a transcendence in the deeper religious meaning. Okay. I mean, there is maybe a connection there, but this would be another podcast to explore those things more carefully. But of course, that's a first type of transcendence that helps to get the group going. And I mean, the thing that I would like to underline is just that, of course, also the social contract theory talks about the creation of the transcendence. But it cannot happen in the way that people just by reason create that. That must be deeper psychological mechanisms that create this self-establishment of a society. And in Hobbes, you have both, and therefore I think he's, in this sense, a seminal thinker.
Okay. Is there anything key you would like to add that you feel we've missed? Obviously, there's a lot we could talk about, but in relation to sort of perhaps approaching mimetic theory.
No, I think for today we have covered the most important things. I mean, the only thing that I forgot was to mention the Decalogue and the 10 Commandments, because this is also one of the reasons that the 10th commandment is really underlining the danger of mimetic rivalry, because the 10 commandments said, do not covet the woman, or today we would say the partner of your neighbor. Do not covet whatever the neighbor has. So the danger of mimetic rivalry is already visible in one of the oldest laws, so to say, in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And again, you can find similar insights in other traditions. So that's maybe a good concluding point. We conclude with the 10th commandment, and that is also a good conclusion for this podcast about Girard's mimetic theory.
Definitely. Okay. Wolfgang Palaver, thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.